20-year-old Gabriel Perez is on his way to hang out in the park with his sister and niece.
Hey, Lisa!
Hey!
Is that my favorite niece?
That's Uncle! Hi, Uncle! Whoa!
Gabriel was really goofy.
Hi! Hey!
Where's there?
How's my favorite niece, huh?
Just outgoing and loving with everyone, anyone and everyone. Just enjoying life, you know, going out, having parties.
Oh, you're having so much fun, aren't you?
He loved my daughter.
The kitty? What kitty?
He was the fun uncle as well.
Do you want to go higher, Bunny?
Gabriel was just really nurturing with her.
He always cared, like, if he saw you down in the dumps, he would say something really goofy to get you back up and going.
You're hanging with your skater buddies this weekend?
Yeah, actually, I'm gonna go to a party with Marianne.
The last time I saw Gabriel, we went to the park and we hung out.
So, Alphas. Hey.
If I would have known that that would have been the last time I actually seen Gabriel in person, I would have told him that I loved him.
What? I never would think, you know, something like this could happen.
I got a party to go to, but catch you guys later.
Bye. Take care.
What's the address of your emergency? My friend called me and said that he fell on his skateboard and he was at McDonald's on me. And I'm over here, and he's like laying there with a bunch of blood, and Okay. you know, his eyes are open. He's not breathing. He's not breathing? Oh my God, there's so much blood. The paramedics are on the way there, okay? I'm so scared.
A 911 call came in indicating that a male had been injured, that he's bleeding. And until officers arrived on scene, they discovered something much worse had happened. They find him laying on the ground by the sidewalk in front of McDonald's. The 911 caller was with him. They assessed his injuries. They quickly realized that this was a major crime that had occurred.
The injured person is Gabriel Perez.
First responding officers began life-saving efforts. But he was pronounced deceased at the scene. By the time I arrived on scene, officers had cordoned off the area. We see he's got multiple apparent gunshot wounds.
Mr. Perez was shot 3 times. One of the bullets went through his heart, and that's what killed him.
The first thing I wanted to do was speak with the 911 caller, who was identified as Marianne Delgado.
Detective Hansen, Detective Jonas.
Fargo PD. Let's talk inside.
She was the only person on scene that knows the victim in this case.
Where were you and Gabe earlier this morning?
We were at a party.
She explained that the two had met up and went to a house party in South Fargo.
Was there any trouble at this party?
I don't think so. I left around 1.
She went back to Moorhead, Minnesota, and left Gabriel Perez back at this house party. Perez starts sending her several messages, and Perez wants her to come back. He wants a ride.
He said, "Yo, where are you at?" I said, "Moorhead." He said, "Can you come pick me up?"
What time was that at?
4:24.
Gabriel Perez was sending multiple texts, increasing in urgency. Around 5 a.m., Gabriel Perez sends her his last message.
"Please come and get me. I fell so effing hard and I'm bleeding bad."
What time?
5:21.
When she got there, she found out what state he was in and called 911. started assessing the scene. I did a walkthrough of it. We see evidence of a shooting. There's bullet impact marks in the sidewalk and in the concrete in the parking lot, on the facade of McDonald's. .145 caliber casing was found on scene. So one of the questions is, where are the other casings?
Get forensics, have them comb the area, see if there's any more casings.
Yep. Gabriel Perez's cell phone was located near his body. We wanted to see if that had any location information to show his whereabouts leading up to his death.
Get a warrant for Gabe's cell phone. See who else he spoke to before he was shot.
Investigators give Gabe's family the news.
This one too. I got a call from my mom.
Hey, Mom.
And she was crying. She ended up blurting out that Gabriel's dead. I remember just dropping on the floor. I just couldn't process any of it.
I hear a loud banging on my door. My dad comes in, and then he told me, and I'm like, Like, are you joking with me? Because it just didn't seem real.
My phone starts ringing, and it's my brother telling me, hey, they found Gabriel dead at McDonald's. Tears were running down my face, and it feels like my rib exploded. I can't even breathe.
There are no witnesses to the crime, so investigators pin their hopes on surveillance footage.
We quickly realized McDonald's had multiple cameras.
Okay, this one right here, this is gonna give us some good footage. We're gonna have this area covered.
It was very fortunate, in a sad way, that this shooting happened outside of McDonald's because there were several cameras pointed directly at the area of the shooting.
Excuse me, you the manager? I need to see your surveillance footage.
They have 2 cameras that covered the side of McDonald's where Gabriel Perez was shot. Camera 15 is pointing towards the south and the east, and that covers part of Main Avenue going towards the east of McDonald's.
Spin it from 5 a.m. Stop. That's him. Play that again.
We can see Gabriel Perez arrive at about 5:20 a.m.
Zoom in from there.
It's at about 5:21 a.m. You can see Gabriel appears to be using his cell phone.
That's when he texts Marianne Delgado.
He was messaging Miss Delgado to tell her to come pick him up, and had told her that he had slipped and fallen on his skateboard. From what you could see in the security footage, he looked uninjured.
We don't know if he did fall off his skateboard or if he was just trying to get Delgado to hurry up and get over to McDonald's. He then sits down on the curb. The next thing we see is a black SUV come flying into the parking lot.
The vehicle immediately approaches Perez, stops.
Gabriel Perez looks up to see who stopped abruptly right in front of him, and immediately stands up and starts running to get away from this vehicle. We don't know why.
That kid looks scared.
The vehicle speeds out of the parking lot and then drives eastbound on Main Avenue.
We need a better look at that vehicle.
You have a camera facing the other way. Can we see that one?
The McDonald's restaurant had multiple cameras.
On this camera, Gabriel Perez sits down, just out of frame.
On the west-facing camera, we could see the vehicle enter the parking lot.
Stop. Play that again.
At 5:23 a.m., we could see the vehicle stop right in front of Gabriel Perez.
Zoom in.
The driver reaches across his body with his right hand. You can see a pistol in his hand. And he fires downward at Gabriel Perez. You can see the recoil from the gun as multiple shots are fired.
He's point blank shooting at the kid.
Perez runs away as far as he can before he collapses to the ground. The actions depicted in the McDonald's footage very clearly identified that the person who pulled that trigger was acting with an intent to kill.
Is that a white male?
Maybe black hair.
You could see that it was a man. You couldn't make out his features exactly, but you could tell that he was wearing some sort of gray shirt.
We really need to ID this vehicle.
Let's go back to the first angle.
Stop. Play that one more time.
We slowed it down, watched it several times, trying to identify what make and model that vehicle is.
That's a Chevy.
It appears to be a black Chevy Trailblazer. There was no license plate visible on the vehicle.
What's that on the rear windshield?
The video wasn't crystal clear, but we could see the vehicle had unique stickers that we keyed in on. There's one on the rear windshield. And there was also another sticker that stood out that was on the rear driver's side door. So we put a bolo out for law enforcement within the whole metro area to be on the lookout for this vehicle.
Next, investigators retrace Gabe's movements to find out what he was doing in the hours before his death.
Delgado told us that she picks up Gabriel Perez and they go to this house party with people that Delgado knew. So the next question was, did anything occur at this party that led to Gabriel Perez's death? Delgado said the people that were at the house party were a friend named Devin and Devin's boyfriend, Ryan. We speak with them.
Hey, this is Detective Hansen from Fargo PD.
What we learned from those interviews was that
you actually suck at this game.
Gabriel Perez showed up. He was hanging out with them. And at one point in the night, he receives some messages. And it seemed like it was possibly something concerning to Gabriel Perez, whatever conversation that he was having over his phone, but they didn't know who he was communicating with. Devin went to bed, and Gabe and Ryan were still up playing video games at the house. Eventually, Ryan went to bed while Gabe was still there. Next day, they wake up, and Gabriel was no longer there.
Okay.
No one really knew where Gabe was going when he left that night. He just left.
We wanted to know, who was Gabriel talking to? What would be concerning in his life? Why did Gabriel go to McDonald's at that time in the early morning hours? We wanted to establish not only his timeline of when he left that house party, but the specific route he took to get to McDonald's. We have a vehicle identified as a suspect vehicle. Is Gabriel Perez being followed by this vehicle along those routes? So it was important for us to find any and all video of Gabriel Perez's route. We looked at surveillance video from a traffic cam on 13th Avenue and South University Drive.
Spool it from 4 a.m.
Sometime after 4 a.m., Gabriel Perez was sending multiple texts telling Delgado he needs a ride. He arrived at McDonald's at 5:20 a.m., so that's the time frame we want to grab this video from.
Look.
That's him.
The traffic cam at University and 13th Avenue showed Gabriel skateboarding at 5:09 a.m.
We could see in that video that Gabe was traveling alone, and he was traveling north.
It's pretty much just him on the street by himself. Watching this video of Gabriel Perez en route to McDonald's, nothing stood out as concerning.
So at that point, the suspect vehicle was still at large, and we had no identified person associated with the shooting.
Across the state line in Moorhead, Minnesota, Gabriel's family is in shock following his murder.
It's heart-shattering, you know? Like, you don't know what to do in that situation. What can you do?
Police can only do so much, but we wanted more to be done. We wanted to know who it was.
Gabe's family was very upset about what had happened, and they took it upon themselves to start solving the crime.
In Gabe's bedroom, the family finds a crucial piece of evidence.
My brother calls and says, hey, I found a phone number. It's not gonna get you nowhere is what I told my brother. It's probably nothing. But he proceeded it and called it anyway.
Hello?
Hello? This is Gabriel Perez's uncle?
There's a frantic woman on the other side of the line, and she just starts bawling, saying, Gabriel's dead because of me. It's my fault he's gone.
Hold on. It's okay. Stay on the line.
He's trying to calm her down, try to get more information.
I want to help you.
Then she hangs up. At that point, I'm shocked, and like I told him, if it's a Minnesota number, a Moorhead number, she has to live close.
Yeah. Approximately 6:40 p.m., we receive a phone call from the uncles of Gabriel Perez.
And what did she say?
They spoke with a female. This female implied that she had knowledge that Gabriel Perez was dead. She was expressing guilt over his death.
She didn't identify herself at that point.
What was that number?
But we knew this number connects to somebody that's going to get us directly to the killer.
Run this.
So we have that phone number ran through the Fargo police records.
Okay, thank you. Any hits?
Looks to be a VO number.
Turns out that phone number was actually a voice over IP number ran by a company called Text Now.
I'm gonna call the DA and we're gonna get a subpoena.
So I submitted an emergency disclosure to Text Now to identify who this woman is.
Just 20 minutes later, investigators received news of another potential breakthrough in the case.
Moorhead police called us and said they located a black SUV that appears to be a black Chevy Trailblazer. So this case is now moving at an extremely fast pace.
The vehicle itself matched the broad description of what was seen on the McDonald's video.
This vehicle was parked in an apartment complex. Black Chevy Trailblazer, no license plate.
There was a sticker on the back of the vehicle which had been partially peeled off.
That sticker that we could see on the surveillance video from McDonald's had been removed. However, they did a poor job at removing it. It was apparent it was the same vehicle.
Well, what do we got here?
There's actually a fired cartridge casing on the outside of the front windshield, right by the windshield wipers. And it's a .45 caliber casing, consistent with the one we found at the scene. And my thoughts are, what are the odds? We then obtained a search warrant and subsequently searched the vehicle. One of the things that was found is a receipt.
See that?
And it's an ATM withdrawal receipt.
From Vision Bank in Fargo, we could see that there was a time and a date stamp. September 22nd at 9:04 p.m., the night that Gabe was killed.
So my next step is I went to Vision Bank and obtained a subpoena requesting that they provide me with any surveillance video the bank has to see who was withdrawing that money at that time.
While investigators wait for the ATM footage, they receive a report on the number that was found in Gabe's bedroom.
Hey, I got a name to match that number.
Shortly after midnight, TextNow gets back to us. I start looking through TextNow's data, which identifies the subscriber as Izetta Cooley.
Detectives run a background check on Izetta. She's a 39-year-old mother of 7.
Izetta Cooley and her husband have multiple children together. They reside in Moorhead. Now we have a big decision on our hands. How do we try to reach out to Izetta in a way that's not going to precipitate further violence? What we decide is we can't risk reaching out until we knew more information.
Why don't you pull up her social media?
Initially, we didn't see any direct link to Gabriel Perez. He's like 20 years old at the time, closer to the age of Izetta Cooley's oldest children.
Investigators analyze Gabriel's Facebook records.
I saw on September 20th, he friended Izetta Cooley. And we can see some Facebook messages between Izetta and Gabriel Perez. Looking through those messages, initially, Izetta sent Gabriel messages saying she was looking for her daughter, and quickly, Gabriel Perez turns a message to Izetta saying how he thinks Izetta was attractive. And that appeared to spark conversations back and forth that read pretty flirtatious between the two of them.
Through the course of the next several days, Izetta and Gabe keep talking.
On September 21st, Gabriel seemed to initiate trying to coordinate a time to meet, that the two were going to be romantic with each other. And then a few hours before the murder, the messages drastically change. Izetta's messages about meeting up with Gabriel appeared to be increasing in urgency.
Izetta reached out to Gabe to set up a meetup at the McDonald's restaurant in that morning.
She's setting up the meet.
Within minutes of him arriving, Gabe reaches out to Izetta and tells her, "I'm here at the McDonald's."
2 minutes after Gabriel sends the message, the driver of the SUV shoots him dead.
The next step was figuring out who it was that was driving that Trailblazer and who pulled the trigger.
Investigators received the surveillance footage from the ATM at Vision Bank.
The receipt showed the withdrawal of the ATM on September 22nd at 9:04. So I wanted to see who was operating the vehicle at that time. And I start looking at that video. I see a black SUV appearing to be a black Chevy Trailblazer. It pulls right up to the ATM. And that's where you get a good look of the driver withdrawing cash.
Stop.
You can see the stickers in the vehicle that matched the McDonald's video.
I'm gonna rewind this.
Most notably, you can see who's driving. He's dressed in the same clothing that the shooter appeared to be wearing in the McDonald's video.
Here's our shooter.
He's getting that receipt.
That was a pretty big moment in the investigation, but now we needed to identify the driver. When we found the vehicle, there was no license plate, but the vehicle has a vehicle identification number or VIN number. We ran the VIN number of that vehicle, and the VIN number came back to Izetta Cooley.
Check for everyone who lives at that residence.
We start running backgrounds on them to figure out as much as we can. Izetta Cooley was married to Miguel Cooley Sr.
Investigators pull up Miguel's license. The photo is a match for the driver in the ATM footage.
There's no doubt it was Miguel Cooley Sr. driving that vehicle. We've now got a suspect identified. So now we have to go apprehend him. We obtain a search warrant for Miguel Cooley's residence.
Fargo PD, we have a warrant to search your property.
Izetta's home. She was somewhat cooperative, but, you know, kind of standoffish a little bit. She says that Miguel Cooley is not at home. If we don't find Miguel Cooley there himself, the evidence we're looking for is any firearms, particularly a pistol. We found a lot of ammunition, some of it .45 caliber, consistent with what we found at the crime scene. We also come across 3 sets of Chevy keys. That's a significant piece of evidence. Those keys link that vehicle to that residence.
That solidified the connection between Miguel Cooley and this crime.
We request that Izetta turn over her cell phone.
Investigators take Izetta to the police department for questioning.
You do have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can only be used against you in a court of law.
She's interviewed by law enforcement. I remember that being a very bizarre interview.
Yeah, dude, I'm barely keeping it together as it is. I mean, I can't even breathe. I can't even breathe.
Izetta was not the most cooperative during the interview. She was very vague on a lot of things. I asked her if she was engaging with some sort of romantic relationship with Gabriel Perez.
There was no relationship.
Why did you want to meet with him? His messages read like you two are flirting.
I wasn't having a relationship.
So you were just toying around with him? Or just flirting kind of for fun? Well, then what does it mean?
Izetta Cooley also was maintaining her husband's innocence.
No, I think you're incriminating us.
I don't know that we can incriminate him more than he's incriminated. The whole shooting's on video.
You guys don't understand. It's not. I'm not talking to you anymore.
Try me.
I'm done.
At the time we're interviewing Izetta, we received a phone call. Authorities in Minnesota have tracked down Miguel Cooley. Miguel Cooley is ultimately located in the Rochester, Minnesota area at his sister and brother-in-law's home. The U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force were brought in to apprehend Miguel Cooley.
Miguel, give yourself up. Show me your hands. Walk towards me with your hands up.
Miguel Cooley has changed his appearance. He's shaved off his beard.
Stop right there. Turn around. Place your hands behind your back.
The task force arrests Miguel Cooley for the murder of Gabriel Perez.
That was a really big relief for me and my family. It's one step closer to getting Gabriel justice.
I was definitely glad that he got found. But at the same time, it's just like I didn't want to accept the fact that Gabriel was gone. So you know what I mean? I just felt so lost on it.
Miguel Cooley is transferred to the Mower County Jail. Myself and 3 other detectives start conducting interviews. We're trying to narrow down exactly why this occurred. And I was curious as to whether or not Miguel Cooley would tell us anything about why he killed Gabriel Perez.
We're here to talk with you about what's been going on the last few days.
Yeah, everything's like blurred.
What pissed you off and got you to the point that Sunday morning happened? Why?
No, I was really drunk. I went to Austin.
Austin, Minnesota?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I went there and wanted to get some tires, but they didn't have any tires at the Walmart there.
All he told us was everything was a blur. He wanted to talk about having a flat tire, so very nondescript, nothing that would rule him out.
He said, I've already taken this attorney, someone told me how to get one.
He requested his attorney, so we never spoke any further than that. It can be a little frustrating at times when people don't want to talk, but I mean, that's their right. Around this time, we're able to get into the cell phone data from Izetta's phone.
We can access her texts.
We wanted to know if Izetta was complicit in any way. I see that there's a text message a few hours after the murder. Izetta sent a message to someone close to her. She mentioned that prior to the murder, Miguel ended up going to a restaurant called the Frying Pan to get food.
Investigators head to the restaurant to analyze the surveillance footage for clues.
We don't know exactly when he was at the Frying Pan, but we could start with working back from when he was at McDonald's.
Can you show us 5 a.m. on September 23rd?
Sure enough, Miguel Cooley entered the restaurant at about 5:09 a.m.
The Frying Pan restaurant is within blocks of the McDonald's where Gabe Perez was shot and killed. So the question was, how did Miguel Cooley know that Gabe Perez would be in that McDonald's parking lot? Just minutes later.
Cooley looks like he's ordered food or is waiting for an order.
In the video from the Frying Pan, you can see Mr. Cooley's wearing the same shirt that he appears to be wearing on both the Vision Bank footage and the McDonald's footage.
Oh, he's really busy on his phone.
So he's within the area of the crime and communicating with someone in the moments before.
We know on the day of the murder, Izetta and Gabriel are exchanging messages. Izetta appears to be asking to meet with Gabriel Perez at the McDonald's. The Frying Pan video showed Miguel Cooley exiting the business at about 5:16 a.m. Gabriel Perez's last message to Izetta Cooley is at 5:21 a.m. And it just says that he's there at McDonald's. And within minutes, Miguel Cooley Sr. drives up and essentially executes him.
Detectives take a closer look at the Facebook messages between Izetta and Gabriel.
One of Izetta's messages, she describes what she's going to be wearing, a white t-shirt and gray pants. That message sounds a little suspicious. Gabriel and Izetta know each other. So if you're going to meet up, why do you need to know what they're wearing? But the messages arranging to meet at McDonald's may not have been submitted by Izetta. That was possibly Miguel Cooley Sr. sending those messages from her account. It's starting to make sense. He's luring Gabriel Perez to McDonald's with the intent to kill him.
The person Gabe believed was Izetta Cooley told him to meet her at the McDonald's. The person he met there was clearly not Izetta Cooley. Miguel Cooley could have sent the messages which led Gabe to go to that location. Miguel Cooley baited Gabe Perez to enter that parking lot. Based upon all the evidence collected in this case, we were able to charge Miguel with murder.
On August 22, 2019, Miguel Cooley appears in court and pleads guilty to first-degree murder. At Cooley's sentencing, prosecutors stepped through the events that led to Gabriel's death.
The evidence really showed that Gabriel Perez was engaging in flirtatious texts with Miguel Cooley's wife.
Gabe and Izetta were apparently communicating through Facebook Messenger. Mr. Cooley was aware of these messages, and that's what fueled him in his rage.
You actually suck at this game.
Gabriel and Izetta arranged to meet at McDonald's. Gabriel was directed to go there from Izetta's Facebook account. But I believe Miguel Cooley probably took over her account.
Mr. Cooley knew Gabe Perez would be outside the McDonald's. When Mr. Cooley entered that McDonald's parking lot, he moved with clear intent. He drove directly towards Gabe Perez, stopped, shot him, and left within seconds. He had one reason for being there, and that was to kill Gabe Perez.
On January 13, 2020, Miguel Cooley is sentenced to 50 years in prison. Izetta Cooley is charged with no crime in relation to Gabriel's murder. There is no evidence that she had any involvement in what happened.
Law enforcement did an exceptional job investigating this case. And part of that was recovering all of the security footage. It was critical for us to prove our charge of murder.
I don't think we'll ever come to terms with losing Gabriel. Losing somebody in general is painful, but losing somebody in the way we lost Gabriel is worse.
Gabriel was one of the most caring people that I knew and that I've ever came across in my life.
Gabriel was close to turning 21 and we're only a year apart, so we were just really close. Not just my brother, but like my friend. I could still like hear his voice, him asking how I am, how loving he was. That's what I miss most about him.
This season on See No Evil.
Kansas City 911. Yo, come, please. Someone got stuck.
This is a personal thing.
The guy shot him and then said, "Remember me, bitch."
We start to look for possible surveillance cameras. If they go inside, you will have them at that point.
There was a strong odor.
I have only ever been able to associate it with death.
It is suspicious. What are they doing with this money?
Oh my God, there's so much blood.
I was just trying to think of who it could have been that killed my brother.
He's luring the victim to McDonald's with the intent to kill him.
The whole shooting's on video.
You had to pull a gun and shoot my brother over a girl?
This was actually a planned out execution.
I believe I've seen a dead person.
He was living a double, if not a triple life.
Got you on video. We've got you on video.
It started with a door that never opened again. On a quiet street in Illinois, in the late summer of 2001, the air carried the slow hum of cicadas and the smell of freshly cut grass. The neighborhood looked like 1,000 others across the Midwest: modest houses, tidy lawns, bicycles leaning against garage doors, children's laughter echoing down sidewalks. Nothing about that evening suggested it would become the beginning of a cold case that would haunt a community for decades. Inside a small brick house at the end of Maple Ridge Drive, 23-year-old Emily Carter was finishing a phone call. Friends would later say she sounded normal, calm, even cheerful. She told her coworker she had plans for the weekend. She laughed about something trivial. Then she said goodnight. No one ever heard from her again. The next morning, Emily didn't show up for work at the local medical clinic. At first, it didn't raise alarm. People miss shifts. Cars break down. Oversleeping happens. But by midday, her supervisor tried calling. No answer. By afternoon, the calls kept going straight to voicemail. By evening, something didn't feel right. Emily Carter wasn't the type to disappear. Her mother called the house just after 6 that evening. Still nothing. By 7 o'clock, worry turned into fear. At 7:43 p.m., the first call went into the police department. A young woman missing. No signs of travel. No explanation. When officers arrived at Emily's house that night, the porch light was still on. The front door was closed but unlocked. Inside, the air felt still, unsettling. Emily's purse sat on the kitchen counter. Her phone lay beside it. Her car was parked in the driveway. Nothing looked ransacked. No broken glass. No overturned furniture. No signs of struggle. But something was wrong. Something deeply wrong. Because people don't simply vanish from inside their own homes. Detectives moved slowly through the house. Bedroom, bathroom, living room. Everything looked ordinary. Almost too ordinary. A half-empty mug of tea sat on the coffee table. A television remote lay beside it. The screen was dark, as if someone had simply stood up and never come back. The back door was locked. Windows closed. No footprints outside. No witnesses. No noise reported. In a quiet Illinois neighborhood where everyone noticed everything, no one had seen anything. By midnight, the missing person report had turned into something heavier. Something colder. Something that would soon be whispered through the town like a storm rolling in. Possible abduction. The following morning, yellow police tape stretched across Emily's front yard. Neighbors gathered in small clusters. Murmurs spreading. Shock turning into unease. Because everyone knew Emily. She volunteered at the church food pantry. She babysat for neighbors. She waved at joggers passing by her house. The kind of person whose disappearance didn't make sense. The kind of person who left behind too many questions. Detectives began retracing her final hours. The last confirmed sighting came from a grocery store cashier just before sunset. Emily had bought bread, milk, and a frozen dinner. Security footage showed her leaving the store alone. Nothing unusual. Nothing suspicious. But investigators noticed something else. A dark pickup truck idling near the parking lot exit. Old model. Possibly late 1990s. The driver remained inside, watching. The footage was grainy. The license plate unreadable. But the truck was there. And it left the lot moments after Emily's car pulled onto the road. At the time, it seemed like a minor detail. A coincidence. But cold cases have a way of turning small details into enormous questions. Back at Emily's house, forensic teams combed every inch. They dusted for fingerprints, collected fibers, photographed the scene from every angle. But the results were frustratingly thin. No blood, no forced entry, no obvious evidence of violence, which left investigators with two possibilities. Either Emily left the house willingly, or someone she trusted walked through that door. And that second possibility would soon cast a long shadow over the entire investigation. Because Emily Carter had a close circle of friends, a small, tight community, people she had known for years, people who had visited her home many times, people who would never have needed to break in. Among them was a man named Daniel Harper, 42 years old, local contractor, family friend, someone who had known Emily since she was a teenager. Harper had helped repair Emily's roof 2 years earlier. He'd attended neighborhood barbecues, holiday gatherings, community events, the kind of familiar face that never raised suspicion. When detectives first spoke with him, he seemed cooperative. Calm. Almost overly calm. He said he hadn't seen Emily in weeks. Said he had been working late that evening. Said he had no idea what could have happened. On paper, his story checked out. But investigators noticed something subtle. Something small. When Emily's name came up, Harper paused. Just for a moment. Not long. But long enough for one detective to write a note in the margin of his report. Unusual hesitation. At the time, it meant nothing. Just another interview in a growing list. Because as the days passed, the investigation expanded rapidly. Search teams combed nearby woods. Volunteers distributed flyers. Helicopters scanned farmland stretching miles outside town. Dogs followed scent trails that faded near the highway, then disappeared. No body, no vehicle, no ransom call, no credible witness. Emily Carter had simply vanished. And with every passing week, the case grew colder. But the silence surrounding it was not empty. It was heavy, dense with rumors. Neighbors whispered theories across fences. Some believed Emily ran away. Others suspected a stranger passing through town. But detectives knew something most people didn't. There was one clue. A strange one. Inside Emily's house, on the kitchen floor, forensic technicians found a single partial boot print. Faint. Smudged. Barely visible under the right light. It didn't match Emily's shoes. And it didn't match the tread of the officers who entered the scene. The print was photographed, cataloged, then quietly filed into evidence, because it might have belonged to anyone. A visitor, a repair worker, a delivery driver, or the last person who ever saw Emily Carter alive. At that moment, investigators didn't realize how important that small, almost invisible mark would become. But cold cases have a way of preserving the smallest ghosts. And sometimes decades later, those ghosts start talking. By the third day, the quiet streets of Maple Ridge Drive no longer felt peaceful. News vans lined the curb. Satellite dishes pointed toward the sky like metallic sunflowers. Reporters spoke in urgent tones while cameras rolled, repeating the same phrases over and over again. Young woman missing, mysterious disappearance, Illinois cold case in the making. Inside the police department, the mood was far less dramatic and far more exhausting. Detectives worked through stacks of paperwork, timelines, and interview transcripts. The early hours of any investigation are critical. Memories are fresh. Details are still intact. But they are also chaotic, a flood of information pouring in from every direction. Every neighbor had something to say. Every coworker remembered something small. A wave from the driveway. A passing car. A dog barking late at night. Most of it meant nothing. But investigators couldn't ignore any of it. They began reconstructing Emily Carter's final 24 hours with careful precision. She woke at 7:10 a.m. Showered. Left the house at 8:02 a.m. Her car appeared on traffic cameras heading toward the clinic where she worked as a receptionist. Colleagues described the day as completely normal. Emily answered phones, scheduled appointments, talked with patients. Around noon, she stepped outside for lunch, sitting on a bench behind the building and scrolling through her phone. A coworker remembered her laughing at something she had read. Later investigators would retrieve that phone. The last text she sent read simply, "See you tomorrow." It went to a friend. Sent at 4:48 p.m. Emily left work at 5:03 p.m. The clinic security camera captured her walking across the parking lot with her purse over one shoulder, keys dangling loosely in her hand. She looked relaxed, unhurried. That image would later become the final confirmed sighting of Emily Carter alive. From there, the timeline became thinner. Traffic cameras showed her car heading toward a small grocery store on the edge of town. That was where the cashier saw her. Emily purchased bread, milk, and a frozen dinner. The cashier remembered the interaction clearly because Emily joked about the long line and apologized for paying with loose change. It was such a small moment. So ordinary. And yet it would become the last conversation anyone could confirm. Outside the grocery store, investigators studied the surveillance footage again and again. The image of the dark pickup truck lingered. Parked near the exit. The driver remained inside. No one stepped out. The truck simply waited. Then Emily's sedan rolled past the camera. And seconds later the truck moved. Detectives zoomed in on the grainy footage until the pixels blurred together. They enhanced the frame, adjusted brightness, tried to sharpen the license plate, but the camera resolution from 2001 had its limits. All they could determine was that the truck appeared older, dark-colored, possibly navy or black, and the driver's face remained hidden behind reflection and shadow. At first, investigators treated it cautiously. Vehicles follow vehicles all the time. It could have been coincidence. But as they built the timeline, the detail kept resurfacing like a loose thread. Because from the grocery store, Emily drove directly home. Her house sat just over 6 miles away. A 15-minute drive. No traffic lights. No complicated turns. Just a long stretch of rural Illinois road lined with cornfields and scattered farmhouses. If someone had been following her, they would have had plenty of opportunity. Detectives canvassed the route the following morning. They knocked on doors, spoke to farmers, asked about unusual vehicles. Most people reported nothing. But one man, an older resident who lived near the halfway point of the road, mentioned something curious. He remembered hearing a truck accelerate quickly that evening. Not unusual by itself. But he recalled the sound because it came shortly after another vehicle passed. 2 engines, close together. At the time, he didn't think much of it. But hearing about the missing woman made the memory feel heavier. Still, it wasn't proof. Just another fragment. Another small ripple in a sea of uncertainty. Back at Emily's home, detectives continued digging into her life. They searched her computer, examined bank records, reviewed phone logs. Nothing suggested she was planning to leave town. No plane tickets. No packed bags. No sudden withdrawals of money. Her bank account remained untouched. Her voicemail silent. Friends described her as steady, predictable, grounded. Emily had grown up in that Illinois town, graduated from the local high school, attended community college nearby. She wasn't someone who simply disappeared, which meant someone else may have been involved. And that realization shifted the investigation toward the people closest to her. Detectives began the long process of interviewing friends, relatives, and acquaintances. Dozens of conversations. Hours of recorded statements. Most followed the same pattern. Shock, confusion, concern. But every once in a while, investigators noticed something different. Subtle inconsistencies. Details that didn't align perfectly. One of those moments came during a second interview with Daniel Harper, the family friend, the contractor, the man who had known Emily since she was a teenager. At first glance, Harper seemed helpful. He answered questions politely, maintained eye contact, even offered to assist in search efforts. But detectives began noticing the same thing again. Those small pauses, those tiny breaks in his rhythm, especially when discussing the night Emily disappeared. Harper insisted he had been working late on a renovation project outside town, a remodeling job for a couple who lived nearly 30 miles away. According to him, he left the worksite around 9 p.m., drove straight home, watched television, went to bed.
Simple. Clean.
But when detectives contacted the homeowners, something didn't quite match. The couple confirmed Harper had been working on their house that day, but they believed he left closer to 7 p.m. Not 9. 2 hours. A gap large enough to notice. When confronted with a discrepancy, Harper brushed it off casually. Maybe they misremembered. Maybe he lost track of time. Construction work runs long sometimes. His tone remained relaxed. But detectives wrote another note in the file. Timeline uncertain. Still, uncertainty isn't evidence. And without physical proof tying Harper to Emily's disappearance, investigators couldn't move further. The case continued branching outward. Search teams expanded beyond the immediate town. Fields were combed. Drainage ditches examined. Nearby lakes scanned by divers. Nothing. Days turned into weeks. The initial wave of urgency began to fade. Media coverage slowed. The news trucks disappeared from Maple Ridge Drive. But inside the Carter family home, the silence felt unbearable. Emily's mother left the porch light on every night, just in case. Her father drove the same rural roads again and again, hoping to spot something overlooked. A piece of clothing, a discarded object, anything. But the roads remained empty. And as summer slowly drifted into fall, the investigation began to stall. Detectives followed every lead they had, interviewed every person connected to Emily's life, examined every piece of evidence collected from the house. And yet the puzzle remained incomplete. The boot print found on the kitchen floor remained unidentified. The mysterious pickup truck remained untraced. And the timeline between the grocery store and Emily's front door remained filled with shadows. By the end of that year, the case had quietly shifted into a category investigators dread: an unresolved disappearance, a potential homicide with no body. And slowly, the phrase began appearing in police documents. 2 words that carry a particular kind of weight: cold case. But what no one realized, yet not even the detectives who had spent months chasing fragments of truth, was that the person responsible for Emily Carter's disappearance had never left the community. He was still there, still attending neighborhood events, still shaking hands, still smiling in conversations that felt completely ordinary. And somewhere, buried beneath layers of time, evidence was waiting, silent, patient, waiting for the moment when decades of silence would finally break. Autumn arrived quietly in that Illinois town, the way it always did. The cornfields turning gold, the air sharpening just enough to remind people winter was coming. Leaves gathered along sidewalks, and the steady rhythm of everyday life slowly returned. But on Maple Ridge Drive, normal life never fully came back. Emily Carter's house stood dark most nights. The porch light still glowed, exactly the way her mother left it, but the windows were empty, curtains unmoving, a quiet structure holding more questions than answers. The town tried to move forward, but Emily's disappearance clung to conversations like smoke. At the diner downtown, people lowered their voices when they mentioned her name. At church gatherings, prayers were still whispered for the Carter family. And inside the police department, the case file grew thicker while progress slowed to a crawl. Detectives re-examined every detail they had collected during the first frantic weeks of the investigation. In cold case work, sometimes the difference between failure and breakthrough lies in something almost invisible: a misplaced timeline, a forgotten witness, a single word spoken during an interview. So they started again. Every interview was reviewed, every timeline reconstructed. The grocery store footage was analyzed frame by frame once more. The pickup truck still lingered in the background of the video like a shadow that refused to take shape. Investigators sent the image to neighboring counties. They circulated descriptions through regional police departments. Older dark pickup truck. Late 1990s model. Possibly Ford or Chevrolet.
But Illinois was full of trucks like that.
Thousands of them. Without a license plate or a driver's face, the lead slowly dissolved into nothing. Attention shifted back toward Emily's personal life. Detectives mapped her social circle on a large whiteboard inside the investigation room.
Friends.
coworkers, neighbors, relatives, names connected by lines and arrows. At the center sat Emily Carter, 23 years old. No criminal history. No known enemies. No recent conflicts. No obvious reason for someone to make her disappear. And yet someone had. The deeper investigators looked, the more the same unsettling reality appeared again and again. Emily trusted people. She trusted her community, which meant the person responsible might have been someone she knew well enough to let inside. The forensic report from the house reinforced that possibility. No forced entry. No signs of struggle. No defensive wounds found in the small traces of evidence collected. If Emily had been attacked inside that house, it likely happened quickly. Unexpectedly. Perhaps even by someone she never believed could hurt her. That theory brought detectives back to the same list of familiar names. And once again, Daniel Harper's name sat quietly among them. Harper continued living his normal life during the investigation. Working construction jobs. Driving his pickup around town. Attending neighborhood cookouts. If the attention bothered him, he didn't show it. He participated in volunteer searches during the early weeks. Walked through wooded areas with flashlights like everyone else. He even spoke to Emily's father once during a community search effort. Placed a hand on the man's shoulder. Said he hoped they would find her soon. It was the kind of gesture people remembered. Because it felt sincere. But investigators often learn something disturbing about people who hide secrets. Sometimes the calmest faces conceal the darkest truths. During a third interview several months after Emily disappeared, detectives pressed Harper harder about his movements on that night. They returned to the timeline again. The missing 2 hours. Harper leaned back in his chair and sighed. He said he might have stopped for gas. Maybe grabbed food somewhere. He wasn't completely sure. The night had been ordinary. Nothing about it stood out. For detectives, that answer felt thin.
Too thin.
Most people remember their evenings clearly when asked about a missing woman they personally knew. But memory is a slippery thing. And without proof that Harper was lying, investigators couldn't push further. They checked gas stations along the route from the construction job back to town. Most had security cameras. But in 2001, footage wasn't stored for long. Within days, it was recorded over. Any potential evidence from that night had already vanished. Weeks turned into months. The Illinois winter arrived with brutal cold. Search operations slowed as snow covered fields and forests. The investigation entered a quiet phase, the part rarely shown on television, where detectives sit with files, photos, and unanswered questions. Emily's case slowly drifted away from headlines. But inside the Carter family home, time had frozen. Her mother refused to redecorate Emily's bedroom. Clothes remained in the closet. Books still stacked on the nightstand. A calendar on the wall remained turned to August 2001, the month she vanished. Every holiday carried the same painful absence. Every birthday came with the same empty chair at the table. And every year that passed deep in the sense that something terrible had happened. Because people who run away eventually leave traces. Bank activity. Phone calls. Sightings. Emily left nothing. By 2003, the investigation had exhausted nearly every lead. Detectives had interviewed more than 70 people. Followed tips from multiple states. Examined hundreds of hours of footage.
Still no body.
Still no weapon. Still no witness who saw what happened inside that quiet brick house. The case officially transitioned into long-term status. Cold case. The words appeared on the folder tab in black marker. 2 words that carried frustration, grief, and unfinished justice. For the Carter family, it felt like the world had quietly moved on without them. For investigators, it meant the answers were still somewhere out there, buried beneath time. And for the person responsible, it meant something else entirely. It meant survival. Years passed. The town changed slowly. New families moved in. Children grew up. Businesses opened and closed. But certain memories refused to fade. Emily's missing poster remained on the bulletin board at the local grocery store for nearly a decade. The photograph showed her smiling softly unaware that the image would one day become a symbol of unanswered questions. And somewhere within that same town, the man who knew the truth continued living among everyone else, driving familiar roads, passing the same grocery store, maybe even walking past that missing poster. The silence surrounding the case grew heavier with time, because the longer a mystery lasts, the more haunting it becomes. Detectives who worked the case early in their careers eventually retired. The evidence boxes were transferred to storage shelves deep inside the police department. Dust gathered slowly on the cardboard lids. But inside those boxes were fragments that refused to die. Photographs of the boot print, interview transcripts, timeline charts, the blurry image of a pickup truck sitting quietly in a grocery store parking lot. Pieces of a story waiting to be completed. And although no one realized it yet, the breakthrough that would one day reopen Emily Carter's cold case was already forming. Not in a witness statement, not in a confession, but in a technology that barely existed when she disappeared. A technology that would begin reshaping criminal investigations across the country. DNA. For years, the small trace evidence collected from Emily's house had been preserved carefully. Fibers, dust particles, the faint smudge of that partial boot print. At the time, forensic science had limits. Tests were expensive. Methods were slower. But as the 2000s progressed, laboratories across the United States began unlocking new ways to extract information from microscopic traces. And one day, more than a decade after Emily Carter vanished, someone would open that evidence box again, and the silence surrounding the case would finally begin to crack. For more than a decade, the evidence box sat untouched on a metal shelf inside the county police archives. Dust gathered slowly across the cardboard lid. The label on the side had faded slightly with time. Carter, Emily, 2001. Missing person/possible homicide. Officers walked past it every day without stopping. New crimes demanded attention. New investigations filled the hallways with urgency. And like many unsolved disappearances, Emily Carter's case had quietly slipped into the background of police work. But cold cases have a strange way of refusing to stay buried. By 2014, forensic technology had changed dramatically. DNA analysis had become faster, more sensitive, more capable of extracting profiles from traces so small they would have been dismissed years earlier. Across the country, law enforcement agencies were reopening long-forgotten cases. Evidence once considered useless was suddenly producing answers. Detective Mark Ellison had been with the department for nearly 20 years when he first opened Emily Carter's file. He wasn't one of the original investigators. Back in 2001, he had been a patrol officer responding to traffic accidents and late-night disturbances. Emily's disappearance had happened on another floor of the building, handled by detectives far more experienced than him. But the case had always lingered in the department's memory. Every officer knew the story. The young woman who vanished from her own home, the empty house, the unexplained boot print, the mysterious truck in the grocery store parking lot, and the unsettling sense that someone in that quiet Illinois town knew exactly what had happened. Ellison requested the file on a slow afternoon in February. The evidence boxes were delivered to his desk in silence. 2 large containers filled with photographs, reports, and sealed plastic bags. He opened them slowly. Inside were the ghosts of a 23-year-old investigation. The first photograph showed Emily's living room. A simple space. Couch. Coffee table. Television. On the table sat the half-empty mug investigators had photographed countless times. Another photograph showed the kitchen floor. And there it was. The boot print. Faint. Partial. Almost invisible. Ellison leaned closer to the image. At the time, it had been considered insignificant. Too incomplete to match to a specific shoe. Too smudged to create a reliable tread pattern. But modern forensic software could sometimes extract patterns from impressions that once seemed useless. Ellison contacted the state crime lab. A request was filed. The original photographs were scanned into a high-resolution digital system. Technicians enhanced the contrast, isolating the faint ridges left in the dust on Emily's kitchen floor. Slowly, shapes began to appear. fragments of a tread pattern. Not enough to identify a brand immediately, but enough to compare against thousands of shoe designs stored in databases. Weeks passed. Then a preliminary report arrived. The pattern resembled a work boot. Heavy sole. Industrial tread. The type often worn by construction workers. Allison stared at the report quietly. Construction workers. That detail alone didn't narrow much. Illinois had plenty of them. But inside the investigation file, there was a familiar name connected to that exact profession. Daniel Harper. Contractor. Family friend. One of the last people detectives had questioned before the case went cold. Allison flipped through the interview transcripts again. Harper's statements read calm, confident, almost rehearsed. But the more Allison studied them, the more subtle cracks appeared. Small inconsistencies. Vague answers about his schedule that night. And always that 2-hour gap between leaving the renovation job and arriving home. 2 hours that had never been fully explained. Still, suspicion alone meant nothing after all those years. If Harper had been involved in Emily's disappearance, the evidence would need to prove it. Which brought Allison back to the other piece of forensic material collected from the house. Trace DNA. In 2001, the technology available could only detect limited genetic information from the fibers and particles gathered at the scene. The samples had been stored carefully but produced no usable profile. At the time, investigators simply didn't have the tools to go further. But 2014 was different. Allison requested a new round of testing. The sealed evidence bags were sent to the laboratory. Inside were tiny fragments collected from Emily's kitchen floor near the boot print. Microscopic skin cells. Possibly transferred when someone stepped into the house. The lab technicians worked slowly, carefully extracting genetic material from the degraded samples. Days passed. Then weeks. Allison tried not to expect too much. Cold case detectives learn patience early. Most evidence yields nothing. But one afternoon a call came from the lab. They had recovered something. A partial DNA profile. Not perfect. Not complete. But strong enough to enter into the National Criminal Database. CODIS. The system used by law enforcement agencies across the United States to match DNA from crime scenes with known offenders. Allison submitted the profile. Then he waited. Days passed without a result. Then weeks. No match. Which meant whoever left that trace DNA inside Emily Carter's house likely had no prior felony record. For some investigators, that would have been discouraging. But for Allison, it raised a different possibility. If the suspect had never been arrested before, the database would have nothing to compare. But there were other ways DNA could speak. New investigative methods were emerging, techniques that used genealogy databases to trace family connections through shared genetic markers. These methods had begun solving decades-old murders across the country. The cases investigators once believed impossible to crack were suddenly producing suspects. Allison considered the option carefully. Genealogical DNA analysis required additional approvals. It also required patience. But Emily Carter had been missing for 13 years. Patience was something this case already understood. The request moved through legal channels. Eventually, the lab began building a broader genetic profile from the trace evidence. A profile that could potentially connect the unknown individual to distant relatives whose DNA had been voluntarily submitted to public genealogy databases. It was a slow process. Complex. But as the analysis developed, something unexpected began to appear. Several distant genetic connections pointed toward the same extended family line. A network of relatives scattered across Illinois and neighboring states. The names began forming a tree. Cousins. Second cousins. Uncles. Branches spreading outward through generations. And slowly, investigators began narrowing the possibilities. They looked for men in the family line who lived near the town in 2001. Men old enough to have known Emily Carter. Men whose professions might explain a heavy work boot leaving that faint print on her kitchen floor. Eventually, the list shrank to only a handful of individuals. Among them, one name stood out immediately. Daniel Harper. The same contractor. The same family friend. The same man who had paused just a little too long when detectives first asked about Emily all those years ago. Ellison stared at the screen in silence. For 13 years, the investigation had circled around Harper without ever landing on solid ground. Now, quietly, science was beginning to draw a line directly toward him. But even then, the evidence wasn't enough. Not yet. A genealogical lead could point investigators in the right direction, but it couldn't prove guilt in court. To do that, they would need a direct DNA sample from Daniel Harper himself. And getting that sample without tipping him off would require patience. Because the man who had lived quietly in that community for over a decade had no idea that the silence surrounding Emily Carter's cold case was about to break. And somewhere inside the police department, the investigation that had once faded into dusty archives was waking up again. By the spring of 2015, the Emily Carter investigation had quietly come back to life. No press releases. No public announcements. Inside the police department, only a small group of detectives knew what was happening. Cold case breakthroughs require silence. The moment a suspect realizes the investigation has returned, evidence disappears, stories change, and the trail grows cold again. Detective Mark Ellison understood that better than anyone. The genealogical DNA results hadn't proven Daniel Harper was the source of the trace evidence from Emily's kitchen floor. But they had done something almost as powerful. They had pointed investigators in his direction again. And this time, the science behind the lead was far stronger than the suspicions detectives carried in 2001. But before anything could move forward, Ellison needed confirmation. A direct DNA comparison. That meant obtaining Harper's genetic sample without raising suspicion. The strategy was simple.
Wait. Watch.
Collect something he discards. It's a method investigators have used for decades. A cigarette but tossed into a trash can. A soda cup left behind at a diner. A tissue thrown away outside a store. Once abandoned in public, those items legally become fair game. The person who threw them away unknowingly leaves a piece of themselves behind. DNA doesn't lie. Ellison and two other detectives began quietly observing Harper's routine. 14 years had passed since Emily Carter vanished, but Daniel Harper's life still revolved around the same small Illinois town. His house sat only a few miles from Maple Ridge Drive. A modest ranch-style home with a detached garage filled with tools and construction equipment. Neighbors described him as quiet, hardworking, the kind of man who fixed fences and helped repair roofs after storms. Someone who had spent years blending perfectly into the background of everyday life. Every morning around 6:30 a.m., Harper left his house in the same dark pickup truck investigators remembered from the early case file.
It was newer now.
The truck from 2001 had long been replaced, but the routine remained consistent. He stopped at the same gas station nearly every morning, bought coffee, sometimes a breakfast sandwich, then drove to whatever construction job he had scheduled that day. For nearly 2 weeks, detectives watched. Not close enough to raise suspicion, just far enough to learn the rhythm of his days. They noted every stop, every habit. One particular detail stood out. Harper smoked, not constantly but regularly enough that the habit offered opportunity. The gas station parking lot had a trash barrel near the entrance. Most customers tossed empty cups and cigarette butts there before walking inside. It became the perfect place to wait. One morning just after sunrise, Harper finished his coffee beside his truck. He stood there for a moment, looking across the quiet parking lot as thin fog lifted off the pavement. Then he flicked his cigarette toward the trash barrel. The glowing tip disappeared inside. He crushed the empty cup in his hand and tossed that in too. Then he walked into the store. Across the street, inside an unmarked sedan, Detective Ellison watched carefully. The moment Harper disappeared through the gas station doors, Ellison stepped out of the car. He moved casually across the lot, as if heading toward the store himself. No rush. No hesitation. He reached the trash barrel and looked inside. The cigarette butt sat near the top. Still warm. He picked it up using gloved fingers, placed it into a small evidence bag, then walked away. It was that simple. A piece of trash. A fragment of burned tobacco. and potentially the key to solving a mystery that had haunted a family for nearly 15 years. The evidence went straight to the laboratory. Technicians carefully extracted DNA from the saliva left on the cigarette filter. Then they compared it to the partial profile recovered from Emily Carter's kitchen floor. The process took time. Several days passed. Ellison avoided checking his phone every few minutes, but the waiting weighed on him. Cold cases are fragile things. Sometimes the breakthrough everyone hopes for collapses under closer examination. Sometimes the DNA doesn't match. Sometimes the suspect was never involved at all. But one afternoon, the call finally came. Ellison answered it quietly inside his office. The lab technician spoke first. "We have the match." Those 3 words changed everything. The DNA from the cigarette butt matched the trace profile recovered from Emily Carter's home in 2001. Not partial. Not uncertain. A direct match. Daniel Harper had been inside that house. Inside the kitchen. Standing on the floor where the faint boot print had been photographed 14 years earlier. Ellison sat in silence after the call ended. For years, Emily's case had been nothing more than fragments. Now, finally, there was something solid. Something real. But even then, the investigation was far from over. Because proving someone was inside the victim's house isn't the same as proving they committed murder. Harper had known Emily. He had visited her home before. A defense attorney could easily argue the DNA came from an innocent visit months or years earlier. The timeline would still be questioned, which meant detectives needed more. They needed to place Harper there on the night Emily disappeared. They needed to break the story he had been telling for 14 years. Ellison reopened the original interview transcripts once again. Harper's statements about his timeline that night had always been vague. Leaving the construction job around 9 p.m., driving home, watching television, going to bed. But investigators already knew something didn't match. The homeowners at the renovation site had believed he left closer to 7 p.m. That gap had never been fully explained. Now, with DNA placing him inside Emily's home at some point, that missing time began to look far more dangerous. Ellison began rebuilding the timeline with fresh eyes. He contacted the homeowners again. 14 years had passed, but they still remembered the evening clearly. It had been late summer.
Warm.
They recalled Harper finishing work earlier than expected. One of them even remembered checking the clock because they were surprised he packed up before sunset. This time, their memory felt firmer. Harper had left at 6:45 p.m. Not 7. Not 9. 6:45. That meant Harper had nearly 3 hours before he claimed to be home. 3 hours unaccounted for. 3 hours that overlapped perfectly with the narrow window when Emily Carter disappeared. Ellison studied the old map again. The drive from the renovation site to Emily's house took roughly 20 minutes. Less if traffic was light, which meant Harper could have easily arrived at her home shortly after 7 p.m. Right around the time investigators believed she returned from the grocery store. The pieces were starting to shift into place.
Slowly. Quietly.
But there was still one more question haunting the case.
Why?
Why would a family friend, someone who had known Emily since she was a teenager, suddenly appear in her house the night she vanished? What happened inside that quiet brick home on Maple Ridge Drive? And perhaps most disturbing of all, had Daniel Harper spent 14 years walking freely through that same community while carrying the answer the entire time? Detectives knew the investigation was approaching its most dangerous moment, because suspects who sense the truth closing in sometimes panic. Sometimes they run, and sometimes they do something far worse, which meant the next step had to be handled carefully. Daniel Harper had lived in peace for 14 years. But now the silence surrounding Emily Carter's cold case was collapsing. And the man who thought the past had disappeared forever was about to realize something terrifying. The evidence had been waiting for him all along. The DNA match changed the entire gravity of the investigation. For 14 years, Emily Carter's disappearance had been a mystery built on speculation, fragments, and uneasy suspicions. Now, for the first time, detectives had something undeniable, a direct genetic link placing Daniel Harper inside the victim's home. But even with that revelation, The case was not yet ready for court. Prosecutors require more than presence. They require narrative, motive,
opportunity,
a chain of evidence strong enough to survive the scrutiny of defense attorneys who will dismantle every weakness they can find. Detective Mark Ellison understood this well. If the case against Harper moved too quickly, it could collapse. So instead of confronting him immediately, investigators chose patience again. They went back to the beginning. Every report from 2001 was reviewed again, this time through the lens of what they now knew. Harper had been in Emily's house. That fact alone forced detectives to reconsider dozens of small details that once seemed meaningless. One of those details came from an old neighbor statement taken just 2 days after Emily disappeared. A woman named Linda Alvarez had lived across the street from Emily at the time. Her original statement described hearing a vehicle engine around 7:30 that evening. Not unusual. But she had added something investigators barely noticed back then. The engine had idled for a moment before shutting off. At the time, detectives assumed it could have been Emily arriving home. But now the detail felt different. Because Emily had already been home by then, which meant someone else may have pulled into the driveway shortly afterward. Ellison requested a new interview with Alvarez. 14 years had passed, and memories fade. But sometimes the emotional weight of an event preserves certain sounds, images, or moments more clearly than expected. When detectives sat down with her again, she spoke slowly, carefully searching through the past. She remembered the night Emily disappeared because of the sudden police activity the next day. Flashing lights, officers knocking on doors, questions spreading through the neighborhood. And that sound, a truck engine. She described it as deeper than a normal car, the rumble of something larger, like a pickup. Ellison didn't interrupt. He simply listened. Then he asked the question carefully. "Did you see the vehicle?" She shook her head. Her curtains had been closed. But she did remember something else. The engine didn't start again right away. Whoever arrived had stayed for a while. 10 minutes. Maybe longer. Then the truck left. The sound of the engine faded down Maple Ridge Drive. At the time, she thought nothing of it. Now, sitting across from detectives 14 years later, the memory carried a different weight. Because by that point in the investigation, detectives had already reconstructed Emily's likely timeline that evening. She arrived home shortly after 7:10 p.m. If Harper had left the construction site at 6:45, he could have reached Maple Ridge Drive within 30 minutes, which meant he may have arrived around 7:20, almost exactly when Alvarez remembered hearing the truck. Another piece fell into place. Still circumstantial, still incomplete, but the pattern was growing stronger. Detectives then turned their attention toward Harper's personal history during the years surrounding Emily's disappearance. On paper, his life appeared steady. He continued working construction jobs, paid his bills, stayed within the same region of Illinois. No arrests, no major legal trouble. But deeper background checks revealed something else. Several former co-workers described Harper as unpredictable, quiet most of the time, but prone to sudden bursts of anger. One man remembered a job site argument where Harper threw a hammer across a room during a disagreement. Another recalled Harper becoming strangely defensive when someone teased him about a woman he had been talking to. At the time, these stories seemed like typical workplace conflicts. But investigators began asking a different question. Had Harper been more emotionally involved with Emily Carter than anyone realized? Ellison searched through Emily's old phone records again. In 2001, cell phone data wasn't as detailed as modern digital tracking, but call logs still existed. Most of Emily's calls were exactly what investigators expected: family, friends, co-workers. But one number appeared several times during the months before her disappearance. Daniel Harper's. The calls weren't constant, just occasional conversations. A few minutes each. Harper had previously told detectives he rarely spoke with Emily directly. Now the records suggested otherwise. It didn't prove anything sinister. Family friends talk. Neighbors call each other. But the pattern hinted that Harper had been communicating with her more frequently than he admitted. Then detectives uncovered another forgotten piece of information buried deep in the original case file. During the first weeks of the investigation, one of Emily's friends had mentioned something odd. Emily had once joked about Harper making her uncomfortable. At the time, investigators dismissed the comment. It had been vague, unclear. But Ellison contacted the friend again. The woman hesitated at first. 14 years is a long time to revisit something painful. But eventually she explained. Emily had mentioned that Harper sometimes lingered too long during conversations, asked personal questions, complimented her appearance in ways that felt off. Not threatening, just unsettling. Emily had laughed about it when telling the story. But she had also made one remark that stuck with her friend all these years. Sometimes he looks at me like he's thinking about something he shouldn't. At the time, it sounded like harmless awkwardness. But sitting in the interview room 14 years later, the friend looked shaken remembering it. Because now everyone knew what investigators were beginning to suspect. Harper may have been hiding feelings that had nothing to do with friendship. And on the night Emily disappeared, he may have acted on them. Detectives carefully assembled the growing timeline again. 6:45 p.m., Harper leaves the construction site. 7:10 p.m., Emily arrives home from the grocery store. Approximately 7:20 p.m., a pickup truck engine is heard idling outside her house. Sometime shortly after, Emily vanishes. Inside the house, a faint boot print remains on the kitchen floor. Trace DNA from that same area matches Daniel Harper. 14 years later, the quiet puzzle pieces were finally aligning. But one critical question still lingered. What exactly happened inside that house? Because if Harper had gone there willingly, if Emily opened the door knowing him, something must have gone terribly wrong inside those walls. And without a body, the truth remained trapped in silence. Which meant the only person who truly knew the answer was the man who had spent 14 years living freely in that same town. Daniel Harper. And investigators were beginning to realize something else. People who carry secrets that long sometimes make mistakes. They slip. They talk. They reveal small pieces of the truth without realizing it. So detectives began looking deeper into Harper's life after 2001. His relationships, his habits, his routines. And what they discovered next would raise a question that chilled everyone involved in the investigation. Because shortly after Emily Carter disappeared, Daniel Harper made a decision that had never seemed important before. But now, 14 years later, it looked very different. Just weeks after Emily vanished, Harper had abruptly sold one of his construction properties outside town. A small piece of land, mostly unused, covered with trees and thick brush. At the time, it was simply recorded as a real estate transaction. Nothing suspicious. Nothing unusual. But when Ellison studied the location on a map, the realization hit him slowly. The property sat only 8 miles from Maple Ridge Drive, hidden deep beyond a gravel road few people used. A quiet place. Isolated. The kind of place someone might go if they wanted to make something disappear. And suddenly, after 14 years of silence, the search for Emily Carter was about to begin all over again. The property sat at the end of a narrow gravel road that most people in the county barely remembered existed. Even in daylight, it felt isolated. Tall trees crowded the edges of the land, their branches bending toward one another like they were trying to close the path behind anyone who entered. The road itself had long since lost its shape, the gravel sinking into soil after years of neglect. Detective Mark Ellison stood beside an unmarked SUV and studied the map again. 8 miles from Maple Ridge Drive. 8 miles from the house where Emily Carter vanished. The property records showed Daniel Harper had owned the land for several years before 2001. Nothing elaborate stood there, no house, no barn, just a small clearing and a rusted metal shed that once stored construction equipment. Then, only 3 weeks after Emily disappeared, Harper sold it. Cheap. Almost suspiciously cheap. At the time, it looked like an ordinary financial decision. But now the timing felt impossible to ignore. Ellison stepped carefully through the tall grass. The air smelled damp, heavy with the scent of soil and decaying leaves. Wind moved quietly through the trees, creating a constant whisper that made the place feel older than it was. This was exactly the kind of location investigators often discovered when reopening old cases. Remote. Hidden. A place where something terrible could happen without witnesses. The land had changed owners twice since Harper sold it. The current property holder, a retired farmer, had been cooperative when detectives explained they needed to search the area again. He seemed surprised the land had any connection to a disappearance from 14 years earlier. To him, it had always just been unused woodland. But to detectives standing there now, the ground felt like a silent archive. If Emily Carter's body had been brought here in 2001, the earth might still remember. Search teams began their work early that morning. Forensic archaeologists walked the land slowly, scanning the soil for disturbances that natural growth patterns couldn't explain. Over the years, vegetation tends to reveal where the ground was once disturbed, subtle differences in plant growth, depressions in the earth, changes in soil color. They moved carefully through the clearing. Metal rods were pressed into the ground to detect softer soil beneath the surface. Ground-penetrating radar scanned sections of the land, sending pulses beneath the earth and mapping what lay hidden below. The process was slow, painstaking, because after 14 years, nature had worked hard to erase any trace of what might have happened there. Ellison stood near the edge of the property, watching the team work. His mind kept returning to the timeline again. If Harper left Emily's house sometime after 7:30 p.m. that night, where did he go next? Did he drive straight here? Did he already know this land would become part of the story? The thought sat heavily in the back of his mind. Investigators often encounter a disturbing pattern when dealing with offenders who commit crimes close to home. They choose places they know, places they feel comfortable navigating in darkness, places they believe no one else will visit. For Daniel Harper, this property would have been exactly that. Private, familiar, hidden. The radar operator raised a hand suddenly. Ellison walked toward the clearing where the technician was studying the monitor. "Something here," the man said quietly. The radar screen displayed an unusual shape beneath the soil. Not large, but different from the surrounding ground layers. A disturbance roughly 6 feet long. Ellison didn't speak for a moment. 14 years of waiting. 14 years of questions. Now the ground itself might be answering. The team marked the location carefully. Shovels replaced scanning equipment. Excavation began slowly, removing soil layer by layer to preserve any evidence that might remain. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The earth gradually opened beneath their tools. Dark soil gave way to a patch of lighter dirt that clearly hadn't settled naturally. Someone had dug here before. That much was obvious. The digging continued carefully. Another few inches. Then one of the archaeologists stopped suddenly. He brushed away dirt with a gloved hand. A fragment of something pale appeared beneath the soil. Ellison stepped closer. For a moment no one spoke. Then the archaeologist said the words everyone there had been expecting and dreading at the same time. Bone. The air seemed to stop moving. Even the wind through the trees fell silent. More soil was removed gently. Soon the shape beneath the earth became unmistakable. Human remains, buried roughly 4 feet below the surface. The skeleton lay curled slightly on one side, as though placed there in haste rather than carefully positioned. A small piece of fabric remained tangled near the ribs. Time had destroyed most of the clothing, but one detail survived. A thin silver bracelet wrapped loosely around the bones of the wrist. Ellison stared at it quietly. The Carter family had described that bracelet years earlier. Emily wore it almost every day, a gift from her mother. After 14 years, the missing person investigation had just transformed into something else entirely. A homicide case. The remains were carefully recovered and transported to the medical examiner's office. Even before official identification, detectives already understood what they had found. Emily Carter had been there all along, hidden in the woods less than 10 miles from her home, waiting 14 years for someone to come back and look again. But finding her remains raised an even darker question. How had she died? The skeleton carried signs of trauma. Subtle but unmistakable. A fracture along the side of the skull. The damage suggested a powerful blow delivered with significant force. possibly from a blunt object, the kind of injury that could cause rapid unconsciousness or death. Investigators studied the report carefully. Inside Emily's house, detectives had never found signs of a violent struggle. No broken furniture, no blood, which meant something else may have happened. Perhaps Harper attacked her quickly. Perhaps she never had time to fight back. The theory began forming slowly. Harper arrives at the house shortly after Emily returns home. She recognizes him, opens the door, lets him inside. They talk. Something changes. Maybe an argument. Maybe an unwanted advance. Maybe something darker. And within minutes, everything spirals into violence. One blow. Maybe more. Emily collapses. The silence that follows must have been terrifying. For a man standing inside a house with a body on the floor. In that moment, Harper would have realized something irreversible had happened. And the decisions he made next would define the next 14 years of his life. Investigators believed he moved quickly, perhaps wrapping Emily's body in something nearby, loading her into his truck, driving through the dark roads he knew so well, straight to the isolated land he owned, digging in the quiet woods while the town slept, then leaving, returning to his ordinary life before sunrise. And for 14 years, that secret remained buried beneath the trees. But secrets rarely stay buried forever. Ellison knew the discovery of Emily's remains changed everything. The evidence was now overwhelming. DNA placing Harper in the house. A suspicious timeline. A burial site connected directly to property he once owned. The investigation had crossed the final line. The quiet surveillance phase was over. Now it was time for something else. Arrest. Because somewhere in that same Illinois town, Daniel Harper was still living his routine life. Still driving his truck to construction jobs. Still greeting neighbors who had no idea what had just been uncovered in the woods outside town. But the silence that protected him for 14 years was gone. And the moment he never believed would come was now only hours away. The discovery in the woods changed the investigation overnight. For 14 years, Emily Carter had been classified as a missing person. A mystery wrapped in silence, speculation, and the painful uncertainty that haunted her family every single day. Now there was no uncertainty left. Emily had been murdered. Her body had been hidden in a shallow grave less than 10 miles from the house where she disappeared. The land had once belonged to Daniel Harper, and the DNA evidence already placed him inside her home the night she vanished. The quiet investigation that Detective Mark Ellison had carefully rebuilt was no longer a theory. It was a case ready to move. Inside the police department, the mood shifted from patience to urgency. Prosecutors were brought in immediately. Boxes of evidence were reopened. Photographs from the excavation site spread across a long conference table. The skeletal remains, the bracelet, the soil patterns showing clear signs of burial. Each piece added weight to the narrative investigators had slowly assembled. But prosecutors needed to be absolutely certain. A cold case, trials are fragile. Defense attorneys often attack the passage of time, the fading memories, the missing witnesses. Every detail must be solid. Ellison laid the timeline out one more time. August 2001. Emily Carter returns home shortly after buying groceries. A pickup truck is heard idling outside her house. Daniel Harper, a family friend, had left his construction job earlier than he originally claimed. DNA evidence places him inside Emily's kitchen. Emily disappears that same night. 3 weeks later, Harper sells a piece of rural land he had owned for years. 14 years later, investigators search that property. Emily's remains are found buried there. The room remained silent for a moment after the explanation finished. One prosecutor leaned forward slowly. "Do we have enough to bring him in?" Ellison nodded. They did. A judge signed the arrest warrant the following morning. The document carried the words that would finally end 14 years of quiet freedom for Daniel Harper. Charge: first-degree murder. But arrests in cases like this are rarely simple. Investigators knew Harper had spent more than a decade believing the past was buried. The moment he realized the truth had surfaced again could be unpredictable. So the arrest had to happen quickly. Unexpectedly. Before he had time to run. Before he had time to destroy anything else. Just after sunrise the next day, 2 unmarked vehicles rolled slowly down the street where Harper lived. The neighborhood looked exactly the way it had for years.
Calm.
Ordinary. Morning light stretching across driveways where cars sat quietly before the workday began. Harper's pickup truck was parked outside his garage. A faint curl of smoke rose from the chimney. He was home. Ellison stepped out of the vehicle with 2 other officers. They walked toward the front door without hesitation. The knock echoed loudly against the wood. For a moment, nothing happened. Then footsteps approached from inside the house. The door opened halfway. Daniel Harper stood there in a gray t-shirt and jeans, his expression shifting immediately from confusion to unease as he saw the officers standing on his porch. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Harper's eyes moved from one badge to another. Then Ellison said the words that would finally shatter 14 years of silence. "Daniel Harper, you're under arrest for the murder of Emily Carter." The reaction was subtle. No sudden panic. No attempt to run. Just a slow tightening of the jaw. A small exhale through his nose. Almost as if he had been holding his breath for years and finally understood that the waiting was over. Harper didn't resist. He allowed the officers to place handcuffs around his wrists. Neighbors watched quietly from across the street as the scene unfolded. Most of them had known Harper for years. Some waved to him when he drove past. Some had hired him to repair their homes. Now they watched silently as he was placed in the back seat of a police car. The news spread through the town within hours. By midday, reporters were back. News vans lined the same streets they had visited 14 years earlier when Emily first disappeared. The headline moved quickly through television broadcasts and online news alerts. Illinois 2001 cold case solved. Family friend charged after decades of silence. For Emily's parents, the phone call came just before noon. Detective Ellison spoke with them personally. He told them the remains found in the woods had been confirmed through dental records. It was Emily. After 14 years of uncertainty, the Carter family finally had the answer they had feared all along. Their daughter had never run away. She had never left town. She had been taken from them the same night she vanished. And the man responsible had lived quietly among them for more than a decade. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. People who had once searched the woods with Harper during the early days of the investigation struggled to process the revelation. He had walked beside them holding flashlights, helping distribute flyers, offering words of sympathy to Emily's parents, all while knowing exactly where her body was buried. The interrogation began that same afternoon. Harper sat inside a small gray interview room with his hands folded on the table. 2 detectives sat across from him. A recording camera captured everything. At first, Harper said nothing. He stared at the table. The silence stretched. Then Ellison placed several photographs in front of him. The boot print from Emily's kitchen. The DNA report. The excavation site in the woods. Finally, a photograph of the silver bracelet found on the skeleton's wrist. Harper looked at each image slowly. His face remained calm, but his eyes lingered on the bracelet a little longer than the others. Ellison spoke quietly. "We found her." Another long silence followed. Then Harper leaned back in the chair and exhaled again. The sound was almost tired. For 14 years, he had lived inside a secret that no one else could see. Now the evidence was sitting on the table in front of him, and the truth he had buried in the woods was staring back. Detectives waited. Sometimes the weight of evidence alone is enough to break someone. But Harper remained quiet. Minutes passed. Then finally he spoke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a few quiet words that filled the room like a sudden storm. "I didn't mean for it to happen." The sentence hung in the air. For the first time since Emily Carter disappeared in 2001, the man responsible had begun to speak. And the story he was about to tell would reveal exactly what happened inside that quiet brick house on Maple Ridge Drive the night everything changed forever. The room remained silent after Daniel Harper spoke those words. "I didn't mean for it to happen." Detectives had heard similar sentences many times before. They appear often in interrogation rooms, a fragile doorway between denial and confession. Not an admission yet, but the beginning of one. Harper leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the metal table. For 14 years, he had carried the story alone. Now the weight of it was sitting in front of him in photographs and lab reports. Detective Mark Ellison didn't interrupt. Interrogations are not about rushing. They are about letting the silence grow heavy enough that the truth begins to surface on its own. Harper stared at the bracelet photo again. Then he began speaking slowly. The voice was quiet, controlled, but beneath it was something else: exhaustion. He said he drove to Emily's house that night because he wanted to talk. That was how he described it.
Just talk.
Ellison asked the question carefully.
About what?
Harper hesitated. His eyes moved toward the wall camera for a moment, then back down to the table. Finally, he answered. About us. The word hung there awkwardly, because for everyone who knew Emily Carter, there had never been an us. She was 23.
He was 42.
A family friend. Someone who had watched her grow up. But inside Harper's mind, the story had apparently been very different. He told detectives he believed Emily cared about him. Said their phone conversations had felt personal.
Said she laughed when they talked.
Said she listened. To Harper, those small interactions had grown into something larger, something imagined, something built quietly over months inside his own expectations. Ellison had seen that pattern before. It's not uncommon in crimes involving people who know each other. One person invents a relationship that only exists in their mind. The other person remains unaware until the illusion collapses. According to Harper, the collapse happened the night he drove to Maple Ridge Drive. He said he knocked on Emily's door just after sunset. She answered. She looked surprised, but she let him inside. They stood in the kitchen at first. The same room where investigators later found the faint boot print on the floor. Harper said he told her he had been thinking about her for a long time. Told her he believed they should be together. The words sounded surreal even as he repeated them in the interrogation room 14 years later. Because Emily had never shared that belief. Not even close. According to Harper's own account, her reaction was immediate. She laughed. Not cruelly. Just out of disbelief. She told him he was misunderstanding things. Told him she thought of him like family. Nothing more. For a few seconds, the conversation remained calm. But then Harper said something changed. Emily asked him to leave. Not aggressively. Just firmly. She told him it was late, and she had work the next morning. That should have been the end of it. A humiliating moment. An awkward conversation. The kind people eventually forget. But Harper didn't leave. He stayed there in the kitchen, standing only a few feet from her. And the more Emily repeated that she wasn't interested, the more the illusion inside his mind began collapsing. Rejection can do strange things to people who have built entire fantasies around someone else. In Harper's case, that rejection ignited anger. He admitted they argued. Voices raised. Emily told him again to leave. Then she said something that triggered the moment investigators had been trying to reconstruct for 14 years. She told him if he didn't leave immediately, she would call the police. For Harper, that threat changed everything. Suddenly, the situation inside that quiet kitchen felt dangerous. Not for Emily, but for him. He imagined the humiliation. The police arriving. Neighbors seeing him escorted out of her house. The reputation he had built in the community collapsing overnight. According to his statement, he panicked. He grabbed something from the counter. A heavy ceramic mug. The same mug investigators had photographed sitting on the coffee table years later. He said he only meant to scare her. But when Emily stepped closer, raising her voice again, the argument exploded. And in a single moment that changed two lives forever, Harper swung the mug. The impact struck the side of her head. Exactly where the fracture was later found on the skull recovered in the woods. Emily collapsed instantly. Harper told detectives the silence that followed felt unreal. He knelt beside her. Called her name. But she didn't move.
Didn't respond.
He said he didn't know if she was unconscious or dead. But he knew one thing immediately. If anyone discovered what had just happened, his life would be over. The decision he made next took only seconds. Harper said he dragged Emily's body toward the door, wrapped her in a blanket from the couch, carried her outside to his truck. The entire neighborhood remained quiet. No one saw him. No one heard him. Within minutes, he was driving away from Maple Ridge Drive with Emily Carter's body in the back of his pickup. The same pickup truck investigators had spotted sitting in the grocery store parking lot earlier that evening. From there, Harper drove to the wooded property he owned outside town. The land he had used occasionally to store building materials. The land where no one would be around at night. He told detectives he parked near the clearing and began digging. The soil was soft in late summer. It took him less than an hour. Then he placed her body in the hole, covered it with dirt, and left. When he finished telling that part of the story, the interrogation room fell silent again. Ellison studied him carefully. 14 years of mystery had just been explained in a few quiet sentences. But even as Harper spoke, something about the story still felt incomplete. Because accidents rarely end with careful burial. They rarely end with 14 years of silence. Ellison asked the final question slowly. "Did you ever think about telling anyone?" Harper didn't answer right away. He stared down at the table again. Then he shook his head. "Every day," he said quietly. The words hung in the air like a shadow that had finally taken shape. For 14 years, the entire town had wondered what happened to Emily Carter. Now the answer was sitting inside a small interrogation room. But the story wasn't finished yet. Because outside that room, the community that once trusted Daniel Harper was only beginning to understand the truth that had been hiding among them all along. By the time Daniel Harper's confession was finished, night had fallen over the police station. The interrogation room felt smaller than it had hours earlier. The air carried that heavy silence that settles in after a long investigation finally reaches the truth. Detectives had spent 14 years chasing fragments, rumors, timelines, blurry footage, faded witness memories. Now the entire story had been spoken aloud. Emily Carter had opened her door to someone she knew, someone she trusted. And within minutes, her life had ended on the kitchen floor of her own home. Harper sat motionless as the recorder continued running on the table between them. His hands rested quietly together, fingers loosely intertwined as if he were waiting for instructions about something ordinary, like the end of a long workday. But there was nothing ordinary about what had just happened. Detective Mark Ellison finally spoke again. "Daniel, do you understand that what you just told us will be used in court?" Harper nodded slowly. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't try to take the words back. For 14 years, he had carried the weight of that moment alone. Now that it was spoken, there was nothing left to hide behind. The officers escorted him to a holding cell shortly afterward. Metal doors closed behind him with a sharp echo that traveled down the hallway. And for the first time since August of 2001, Daniel Harper was no longer a free man. Outside the station, the town had already begun absorbing the shock. News traveled quickly in small communities. By the next morning, every cafe, grocery store, and gas station carried the same headline across television screens and phone notifications. Illinois 2001 cold case solved. Family friend charged after decades of silence. For many residents, the words felt unreal. People remembered Harper as the quiet contractor who helped repair storm damage, who attended local church gatherings, who waved from his truck when driving past familiar houses. Some of them had even joined him during the early volunteer searches for Emily Carter. They had walked through fields together holding flashlights. They had called her name into dark forests. They had believed he was searching for answers, just like everyone else. Now they knew something different. He had known exactly where she was the entire time. At the Carter family home, the news landed with a mixture of grief and a strange, painful relief. Emily's parents had spent 14 years trapped in the most unbearable kind of uncertainty, not knowing if their daughter had suffered, not knowing if she might still somehow be alive somewhere. Now, they finally had the truth. It was terrible, but it was real. And reality, even when it hurts, is easier to carry than endless questions. A few days later, The community gathered for the first memorial service Emily Carter had ever received. 14 years after she vanished. The church filled with people who remembered her as the smiling young woman who once volunteered at charity drives and helped neighbors with small errands. Photographs of Emily were placed along the front of the room. In every image, she looked the same, warm, bright, completely unaware that her life would one day become a headline across the country. Detective Ellison attended quietly in the back row. Cold case investigators rarely appear in the public moments that follow an arrest. Their work happens in quiet offices and evidence rooms, far from the cameras. But Ellison wanted to be there, because for 14 years Emily Carter had been more than a file on a shelf. She had been a question that refused to fade, a reminder that somewhere, someone knew the truth. And now that truth had finally surfaced. The trial preparations began soon after. Prosecutors built the case carefully. The confession would be powerful, but they also presented the physical evidence that tied Harper to the crime. The DNA recovered from Emily's kitchen floor. The witness statement about the truck engine outside her house. The property records showing Harper owned the land where her body was buried. The forensic report confirming the fatal skull fracture caused by blunt force trauma. Each piece fit together like the fragments of a puzzle that had waited 14 years to be completed. When the trial finally began, the courtroom filled quickly. Residents of the town wanted to see the man who had hidden such a terrible secret among them for so long. Harper looked older than the photographs from 2001. Time had added gray to his hair, deep lines to his face. But the quiet demeanor remained the same. During the proceedings, prosecutors described the events of that night step by step. They showed the jury the images from the excavation site. They displayed the bracelet recovered from the grave. Emily's mother covered her face when the photograph appeared on the screen. The defense attempted to soften Harper's confession. They argued the death was not premeditated. They described the moment as a tragic accident triggered by panic. But the prosecution reminded the jury of something critical. Accidents don't end with secret burials. Accidents don't stay hidden for 14 years while a family searches desperately for answers. Those choices, the digging, the silence, the lies, were not accidents. They were decisions. Deliberate ones. When the jury finally retired to deliberate, the tension inside the courtroom felt thick enough to touch. Outside, reporters waited in the hallway, their cameras ready. Inside the jury room, 12 strangers studied 14 years of evidence and testimony. The deliberation lasted less than 5 hours. When they returned, the courtroom fell completely silent. The foreperson stood. The verdict was read slowly. Guilty of first-degree murder. The words echoed through the room like the closing of a door that had been open far too long. Emily Carter's case was no longer a mystery. The man responsible would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But even after the verdict was announced, the emotional weight of the story didn't disappear. Because the real impact of a crime like this spreads far beyond the courtroom. It lingers in memories. In quiet streets. In the empty spaces left behind. And in the knowledge that for 14 years, the truth had been hiding in plain sight within the same community that had searched so desperately for it. Yet even with the trial over and the sentence delivered, the story of Emily Carter's cold case still carried one final shadow, a reminder of how fragile safety can be and how easily trust can be broken by someone standing only a few feet away. Years later, the town still remembers the night everything changed. Not the night Daniel Harper was arrested. Not the day the verdict was read in court. But the quiet evening in August of 2001 when Emily Carter simply disappeared from her home on Maple Ridge Drive. For 14 years, that moment existed like an open wound in the community's memory. A young woman vanishes. No witnesses. No struggle. No explanation. Just a porch light glowing outside a silent house. In small towns, mysteries like that never really fade. They become part of the landscape, whispered about during late-night conversations, mentioned quietly when new families move in and ask about the strange empty house at the end of the street. And for more than a decade, Emily Carter's story remained exactly that. A question. a shadow stretching across the years. Even after Daniel Harper was sentenced, even after the confession and the evidence finally closed the investigation, the town struggled to understand how something so terrible had been hiding among them for so long. Because Harper had never looked like a monster. He looked like someone ordinary. The contractor who waved from his truck. The neighbor who helped repair fences. The man who stood beside volunteers holding flashlights during the first frantic search for Emily. That image is what disturbed people most. Not the violence of the crime itself, but the realization that the person responsible had walked quietly through the same streets afterward as if nothing had happened. For 14 years, he attended barbecues, spoke to neighbors, and passed the Carter family in grocery store aisles knowing something they did not. Knowing where their daughter was buried. Detective Mark Ellison thought about that often after the case was closed. Cold cases change the way investigators see the world. They reveal how long the truth can remain buried beneath routine, beneath politeness, beneath the simple appearances people present every day. When Ellison visited the wooded property one last time after the trial, the clearing looked peaceful again. The excavation site had been filled carefully. Grass had begun growing over the disturbed earth. The wind moved softly through the trees, creating that same quiet whisper investigators heard when they first arrived there. Nature has a way of reclaiming everything eventually. But the ground still held the memory of what happened. Emily Carter's remains had finally been returned to her family after the investigation ended. Her parents held a private burial ceremony. Not a large public gathering, just close relatives and a few friends who had carried the weight of her disappearance for 14 years. At the service, Emily's mother placed the silver bracelet beside the casket. The same bracelet investigators found wrapped around the bones of her wrist in the shallow grave. It had survived everything. The darkness of the soil. The passing of time. 14 silent years beneath the earth. Now it returned home with her. After the case closed, the police department archived the files again. But this time the label on the box had changed. No longer missing person. No longer unsolved. The final classification was simple. Solved. Emily Carter's name would no longer appear on cold case lists. Her story would not remain a mystery waiting for someone to reopen the file. Justice had finally caught up with the truth that Daniel Harper buried in the woods that night. But even with the legal ending complete, the emotional aftermath remained. Cold cases leave echoes. They linger in the memories of investigators who spent years staring at photographs of a victim whose voice they never heard. They linger in families who spent birthdays and holidays wondering whether their loved one might still be alive somewhere. And they linger in communities forced to confront the unsettling reality that evil sometimes hides behind familiar faces. Today, if you drive down Maple Ridge Drive, the neighborhood looks exactly the way it did years ago. The houses are still modest. The sidewalks still quiet. Children still ride bicycles past the same driveways. Emily's old house eventually found new owners. They painted the porch, replaced the curtains. Life moved forward the way it always does. But some residents still glance toward that house when they pass it. Because they remember. They remember the flashing police lights that first appeared there in 2001. They remember the missing posters that hung in the grocery store window for years. And they remember the morning the news broke that the man responsible had been living among them the entire time. Emily Carter was 23 years old when her life ended in that kitchen. Her story might have remained hidden forever if the evidence had never been reopened, if technology had never advanced far enough to extract a DNA profile from a faint trace left on a dusty floor. That tiny fragment, invisible to the eye, silent for 14 years, eventually spoke louder than any witness. It connected a man to a crime he believed had disappeared with time. And in doing so, it proved something that every cold case investigator knows deep down. Time may bury the truth, but it rarely destroys it. Somewhere inside every unsolved case, the evidence waits. Quiet. Patient. Waiting for the moment when someone looks again. Waiting for the moment when silence finally breaks. And when that moment arrives, even the darkest secrets can no longer stay hidden. Long after the courtroom emptied and the headlines faded, the story continued to live in quieter places. Not in police reports, not in television broadcasts, but in the memories of people who had once searched for a missing young woman without knowing the truth was standing beside them the entire time. Cold cases leave that kind of mark. They change the way a community remembers its own past. Before 2001, Maple Ridge Drive had been just another quiet street in Illinois, a place where neighbors waved from driveways and summer evenings carried the soft sounds of lawn mowers and distant radios. After Emily Carter vanished, the street became something else, a place tied to a question that no one could answer. For 14 years, parents in the neighborhood glanced out their windows more often when their children played outside. Front doors were locked a little earlier at night. People began noticing vehicles they once ignored. The disappearance had created a permanent unease that no one could fully explain. And when the truth finally surfaced, that unease didn't disappear. It transformed. Because the Rayal story turned out to be more disturbing than anything the town had imagined. The danger had never come from a stranger passing through. It came from someone who had always belonged there. Daniel Harper had not been a shadow lurking outside the community. He had been part of it. He attended the same church gatherings, drove the same roads, shared the same casual conversations people have every day without thinking twice. And for 14 years, the quiet knowledge of what he had done traveled with him everywhere he went. Investigators sometimes talk about something called the long silence. It's the strange period that follows a crime when the offender continues living normally while the victim's story remains unfinished. Birthdays pass. Holidays come and go. Entire chapters of life unfold while the truth stays buried somewhere unseen. For Emily Carter, that silence lasted 14 years. 14 birthdays her family never celebrated. 14 Christmas mornings with an empty place at the table. 14 years of wondering if somewhere, somehow, she might still be alive. Detective Mark Ellison thought about that often after the case was closed. Cold case investigators rarely forget the faces inside their files. Those photographs stay with them. The last known image of someone who had no idea their life was about to end. Emily's photograph had been one of those images. A simple portrait used on missing posters across the state. A warm smile. Clear eyes. The expression of someone who trusted the world around her. That photograph had remained pinned to a bulletin board inside the department for years. Even after the investigation slowed. Even after the evidence boxes were moved into storage. Now the photograph was gone. Not because anyone forgot her, but because the question attached to that image had finally been answered. Emily Carter was no longer a missing person. Her story had reached its conclusion. Still, the echoes of the case continued spreading outward long after the trial ended. Law enforcement agencies across Illinois used the investigation as an example of how modern forensic science could reopen cases once believed impossible to solve. The DNA recovered from Emily's kitchen floor had been nearly invisible, a trace so small it had remained meaningless for years. But technology changed. Methods improved. And eventually that microscopic fragment of evidence became the voice that exposed the truth. For detectives working other unsolved cases, the lesson was powerful. Evidence doesn't expire. Even the smallest clue can survive decades if it is preserved. Somewhere, in forgotten boxes inside police archives across the country, similar fragments are still waiting. Waiting for the moment when science finally catches up with the crime. But for the Carter family, the case was never about technology or investigation techniques. It was about closure. About finally knowing where their daughter had been all those years. About bringing her home. When Emily's parents visited her grave for the first time after the burial, the cemetery was quiet. A small headstone marked the place. Simple. Modest. Her name. Her birth year. The year her life ended. No long inscription. Just the dates that framed the story of someone who should have lived far longer. Her mother placed fresh flowers beside the stone. The same way families do in cemeteries everywhere. A quiet gesture repeated again and again over time. Because grief doesn't disappear when justice arrives. It simply changes shape. But there was something else present there too. Relief. Not the kind that erases pain, but the kind that comes from finally knowing the truth after years of darkness. The Carter family no longer had to wonder, no longer had to imagine 1,000 different possibilities for what might have happened that night. They knew, and knowing allowed them to begin the long process of letting the past settle. Back in the town where everything began, Maple Ridge Drive looks no different today than it did decades ago. The houses remain the same. The sidewalks still carry the quiet rhythm of ordinary life. New families live there now. Children who never heard Emily Carter's name ride bicycles down the same stretch of pavement. But some of the older residents still remember. They remember the flashing lights that first appeared outside her house. They remember the missing posters that stayed taped to store windows year after year. And they remember the moment the truth finally surfaced, the moment the town learned that the man responsible had never truly disappeared at all. The Emily Carter case began with a mystery. A young woman gone without a trace. A silent house. An unanswered question. It ended with something else entirely. A confession. A grave discovered in the woods. And the slow, difficult understanding that the truth had always been closer than anyone imagined. Cold cases often feel like stories that never reach an ending. But sometimes, even after years of silence, the evidence speaks. Sometimes the smallest clue refuses to fade. And when that happens, the past has a way of returning, not as a rumor or suspicion, but as the undeniable truth that finally breaks through the quiet. The kind of truth that waited 14 years to be heard. In the years since the case was closed, investigators still talk about it. Not because it was the most complex investigation they ever worked, not because it involved some elaborate criminal mastermind, but because of how ordinary it seemed at first. Cold cases often begin that way, quietly. A missing person report, a house that looks untouched, a timeline with just enough uncertainty to let doubt creep in. When Emily Carter disappeared in the spring of 2001, nothing about the situation immediately suggested a crime that would remain unsolved for more than a decade. There were no signs of forced entry. No struggle obvious to the first officers who walked through the house. Her car sat in the driveway. Her phone remained inside. At first, investigators wondered if she had simply left. People sometimes disappear voluntarily. They start over somewhere else. It happens more often than the public realizes. But as the hours passed, that explanation began to feel less convincing. Emily had left behind everything. Her purse, her identification, even the jacket she usually wore on cold evenings. Those small details slowly shifted the investigation in another direction. Something had happened inside that house. Something that left almost no visible trace. That absence of evidence became the greatest obstacle detectives faced. For weeks, investigators interviewed neighbors, friends, co-workers, and anyone who might have seen Emily during her final hours. Most of those conversations led nowhere. People remembered ordinary moments. A quick greeting. A passing conversation. Nothing that hinted at violence. And yet one detail kept resurfacing. Daniel Harper. At the time, Harper was simply another familiar face in the neighborhood. He had known Emily casually. They had spoken before. Nothing about that connection seemed suspicious. Not at first. But detectives noticed something subtle during early interviews. Harper was helpful. Too helpful. He volunteered information without being asked. Speculated about possibilities investigators hadn't mentioned. Even suggested theories about strangers passing through the area. Experienced detectives recognize that behavior. Sometimes it means nothing. Other times, it means someone is trying to control the direction of the conversation. But suspicion alone isn't evidence. And without proof, the investigation could not move forward. Years passed. Detectives retired. Evidence boxes gathered dust inside storage rooms where thousands of unsolved cases wait in quiet rows. Emily Carter's file became just one among many, until technology changed the rules. When the Illinois State Crime Lab reopened the evidence in 2015, the forensic team wasn't expecting a miracle. They simply wanted to see if newer DNA extraction techniques could recover anything overlooked during the original investigation. That's when they found it. a microscopic biological trace preserved on the kitchen floor. Too small to identify with older testing methods, but just large enough for modern analysis. The lab ran the profile through the national database. And for the first time in 14 years, the case produced a name: Daniel Harper. The match forced investigators to reconsider everything they thought they knew. Harper had already been interviewed early in the investigation. His explanations had seemed ordinary at the time. He lived nearby. It wasn't unusual for him to have visited the Carter home before. But the DNA wasn't found in a place where casual contact made sense. It was found in the exact area where forensic experts now believed Emily had been attacked. That discovery reopened the case completely. Detectives returned to Harper with new questions. At first, he repeated the same calm explanations he had given years earlier. But investigators had something they didn't have before: evidence that placed him at the center of the crime scene. And over the course of several tense hours, the story he had maintained for 14 years finally collapsed. The confession that followed was quiet. No dramatic outburst. No sudden emotional breakdown. Just a slow admission that the truth could no longer be avoided. Harper described an argument that escalated beyond control. What began as a confrontation turned into violence. And once the damage was done, fear took over. He buried Emily's body deep in a wooded area outside town, a place he believed no one would ever search. For years, that belief held true, until the smallest fragment of DNA changed everything. When investigators led Harper back to the burial site, the forest had grown thick with time. Trees stood where none had existed before. Leaves covered the ground in layers built over more than a decade. But Harper still remembered exactly where he had dug. Within hours, forensic teams uncovered the remains. After 14 years, Emily Carter had finally been found. The moment investigators confirmed the discovery, Detective Mark Ellison stood quietly at the edge of the clearing. Cold case detectives rarely experience that moment. Many investigations remain unresolved forever. But sometimes, rarely, the silence ends. And when it does, the truth that emerges is often simpler and darker than anyone expected. Emily Carter's story wasn't the result of a complex conspiracy. It wasn't a stranger passing through town. It was a single violent moment hidden for 14 years behind ordinary life. A reminder that some of the most disturbing crimes are not committed by shadows. They are committed by people who once seemed completely familiar. And sometimes, the only thing standing between a mystery and the truth is time. Cases like Emily Carter's often leave behind more than a solved investigation. They leave questions that investigators, families, and entire communities continue asking long after the courtroom lights go dark. One of the most unsettling questions is always the same. How did no one know? For 14 years, Daniel Harper lived an ordinary life. He went to work, paid bills, attended neighborhood gatherings. People spoke with him in grocery stores and waved when they passed him on the street. Some even remembered him helping search during the early days after Emily vanished. That detail, in particular, haunted detectives once the truth came out, because it meant Harper had stood among the very people hoping to find the woman he had already buried. It's a pattern investigators have seen before. Criminal psychologists sometimes call it returning to the scene socially. Not physically returning to the crime scene itself, but remaining close to the environment where the crime occurred. Remaining inside the community, inside the conversations, sometimes even inside the search efforts. To outsiders, that behavior seems impossible to understand. But for many offenders, staying close offers a strange sense of control. They can watch the investigation unfold, listen to rumors, measure how close police might be to discovering the truth. In Harper's case, that control lasted 14 years. 14 years where every knock at the door could have been detectives returning with new evidence. 14 years where every news story about advances in DNA technology carried a silent risk. Cold cases create a unique kind of pressure for the people responsible, even when they appear calm on the surface. Even when life continues normally, because the one thing they can never control is time. Technology evolves. Evidence gets re-examined. New investigators bring fresh eyes to old files. And the smallest forgotten clue can suddenly become the key that unlocks everything. Detective Ellison often told younger investigators something simple about cold cases. Time is the one advantage we have. Witness memories fade, but evidence, if preserved properly, does not. A fingerprint remains a fingerprint. DNA remains DNA. A fiber, a drop of blood, a single hair, all of it can wait quietly for years until science catches up. That truth has changed criminal investigations dramatically over the last 2 decades. Cases once considered impossible to solve are now reopening across the country. Advanced DNA sequencing, genetic genealogy, digital reconstruction of degraded evidence. Each new tool pushes the boundaries of what investigators can discover. And every time an old case is solved, it sends a message to anyone hiding behind the silence of the past. The clock is still ticking. For the Carter family, however, the investigation was never about scientific breakthroughs or forensic milestones. It was about Emily, about the young woman who loved photography, long drives in the countryside, and quiet evenings spent with her family. The Emily they remembered wasn't the victim described in police reports. She wasn't a cold case file number. She was a daughter, a sister, a person whose life had been interrupted in a single violent moment. During the sentencing hearing, Emily's mother spoke directly to the courtroom. Her voice remained steady, but every word carried the weight of 14 lost years. She talked about the night Emily disappeared, about the long period when hope and fear existed side by side, and about the moment detectives finally told them the truth. Not every family in a missing person case receives that moment. Many never learn what happened to the people they love. Many never find a grave to visit. Emily's parents knew that. And despite everything they had endured, they understood that the answer they received, painful as it was, gave them something others still search for: closure. When the hearing ended and the courtroom slowly emptied, the Carter family stepped outside into the quiet afternoon. The world looked ordinary. Cars moved along the street. People walked past without realizing the long story that had just reached its final chapter inside that building. Cold cases rarely end with dramatic scenes. More often, they end quietly, with paperwork, with evidence returned to storage, with detectives closing files they once feared would remain open forever. But behind those administrative steps lies something deeper: a restoration of truth. Emily Carter's story had begun as a mystery that seemed destined to remain unsolved. A young woman gone without explanation. A community left wondering what had happened on a quiet spring night. 14 years later, the truth finally emerged from the smallest fragment of evidence. And with it came a powerful reminder: crimes hidden by time are not always lost. Sometimes they're simply waiting for the moment when science improves. When investigators take a second look. When one overlooked detail finally reveals what had been buried all along. The silence of a cold case can last years, sometimes decades. But silence is not the same as disappearance. And for those who continue searching for answers, Emily Carter's case proved something important. Even after 14 years, the truth can still find its way back.